Hi, this is Dale Maley. Today we will be reviewing the case of Abraham Lincoln's three Pontiac legal cases where he was involved as a lawyer in Livingston County, Illinois. This presentation was given to the Livingston County Historical Society Thursday night, November 18th, 2021. The first slide here on the left is an illustration of a young Abraham Lincoln involved with the first case heard in Livingston County. And on the right-hand side, Henry Weed. The county was only formed in 1837 and the first case was 1840, so they didn't have time to build a courthouse. So the first legal proceedings in the county were held in the log cabin of Henry Weed. This is not Henry's log cabin, it's just a typical log cabin picture. There is a website which actually lists every single case that Abraham Lincoln was involved with as an attorney. If we search that website for cases heard in Livingston County, Lincoln was involved in a total of 3 cases. The first case was in May of 1840, and it was Mr. Wilson versus Mr. Popejoy. And in this case, Wilson allowed Popejoy to ride his horse from Money Creek, Illinois to Bloomington, Illinois and back. Popejoy agreed to care for, feed, and to shod the horse and pay Mr. Wilson $1. Mr. Popejoy failed to take care of the horse, it was alleged, and the horse died after returning. So Wilson then sued Popejoy in an action of assumpsit, must be a legal term, and requested $300 in damages. Popejoy retained Abraham Lincoln as his lawyer and claimed that Wilson owed him some money for some other affairs. The jury found for Mr. Wilson, in other words, Abe Lincoln lost the case, but Lincoln got the damages reduced from $300 to only $70. Then just 5 months later, in October of 1840, Mr. Popejoy turned around and sued Mr. Wilson. Wilson claimed that Popejoy stole Mrs. McDowell's meat. Popejoy must have been happy with Lincoln's performance in the first case, so he kept him as his attorney, and he sued Wilson in an action of slander, seeking $2,000 in damages. Mr. Wilson initially pleaded not guilty, but later he apparently withdrew his plea and confessed a judgment for the $2,000. In other words, Lincoln won this case on this one. The third case was in 1843. Mr. Blue, who was the acting sheriff of Livingston County, accused Eliza Allen of perjury. Eliza Allen, her husband Moses Allen, sued Blue in an action of slander. The jury found Blue guilty and awarded Allen's $250. Blue retained Logan and Lincoln and appealed to the Illinois Supreme Court. The Allens failed to file a joinder in error and defaulted. The court reversed the judgment. Livingston County was formed in 1837, so there was no court cases held in the county until May of 1840. And since the county had only been around 3 years, no courthouse had been built yet. So, for a courthouse, they used Henry Weed's log cabin on the Vermilion River. The jurors sat and deliberated on sawn logs that were laying outside the log cabin. Now let's look up the history of Pontiac Township, and the legal description of that is 28 North, Range 5 East. And using one of the maps of Livingston County, we can see that the city of Pontiac is in section 22. And I'm assuming that the original town was on the Vermilion River, so that means the original town would be in the lower half of section 22. The United States federal government maintains a database under the U.S. Department of the Interior, under the Bureau of Land Management. And this database is very good. You can search by the name of the person who initially bought the land from the federal government, or if you know which section you're looking at, you put in the legal description and it'll tell you who the first purchasers of that land was from the federal government. So in this case, down at the bottom, We're going to enter in Township 28 North, Range 5 East. We're on the third principal meridian, and we're interested in Section 22. Once we hit the Enter key, we get the results of our search, and what we find is in that south half of that section, there were two gentlemen that purchased that land from the federal government. Henry Weed is shown first, and the other gentleman is William H. Wells. They bought this land on the same day, November 10th of 1840, and the first entry for Henry Weed, he bought the east one half of the southeast quarter. The second entry, he bought the west one half of the southeast quarter. And then William Wells, he had two different tracts, the east half of the southwest quarter and the west half of the southwest quarter. So Henry Weed and William H. Wells own the land where the original village of Pontiac was created. So at this point, we can assume that Mr. Wilson and Mr. Popejoy really did not like each other very well, since they sued each other. And then the question becomes which Mr. Wilson and which Mr. Popejoy was involved with these cases. After some research, we discover that Mr. Wilson was Isaac Lincoln Wilson. He was born in 1812 in Greene County, Indiana. In 1835, at the age of 22, Isaac married 17-year-old Harriet Bishop in Indiana. The Isaac Wilson family then moved from Indiana to Avoca Township in 1837. Isaac farmed in Avoca Township, which is north of Fairbury, and he hauled his grain to Chicago initially, when that city was a small village almost buried in mud and mire. And many of the early pioneers had to take their grain or livestock all the way to Chicago because there was no other markets to sell those items. When Livingston County was formed back in 1837, Isaac Wilson was one of the first men elected to the position of Justice of the Peace. He actually served 10 years in that position. In 1840, Isaac Wilson purchased 80 acres from the federal government in Section 36 of Avoca Township, north of Fairbury. This land is in the southeast corner of Avoca Township on Indian Creek. And I did a study where I looked up where all the early pioneers bought their land, and every single one in the Fairbury area chose to buy their land on Indian Creek or the Vermilion River, because in those days, good land was considered to have water and trees. It's rather ironic today, it's the opposite. That ground is usually lower value than ground out on the prairie because the prairie land is more productive. With respect to which Popejoy was involved in these cases, turns out that it was William Champion Popejoy Sr. He was born in 1793 in Darke County, Ohio. When he was 24 years old in 1817, he married Rebecca Hanneman in Ohio. The William Popejoy family then moved from Ohio to Avoca Township in 1831. Now, 1 year later, in early 1832, the McDowell family settled on Indian Creek, about 3 miles north of Fairbury. The Popejoy and McDowell families were among a small group of early settlers that temporarily went to Indiana during the 1832 Black Hawk War. At that time, there was about 600 Kickapoo Indians living south of Chatsworth, so people got really nervous in this area whether or not those Kickapoo might attack them or not. But they did not. They went to Indiana for a while. When the war was over, it was only a 5-month war. They returned to their homes when the war ended. In 1840, William Popejoy purchased 4 tracts of land from the federal government. He purchased a total of 280 acres in Section 11 of Avoca Township, north of Fairbury. William's farm was about 4 miles north of the farm of Isaac Wilson, so they were sort of neighbors. And then the small village of Avoca, which was started by the McDowells, William lived 1 mile from the village of Avoca, and Isaac Wilson lived about 3 miles from the little village. So in 1840, when the legal cases took place, Isaac Wilson would have been 28 years of age, and William Popejoy would have been 47 years of age. So Popejoy was old enough to be the father of Wilson. Maybe this age difference was one of the sources of friction between the two men. And young Abraham Lincoln, the attorney, was only 31 years old. So, on that first legal case, Mr. Popejoy asked Mr. Wilson if he could rent his horse for a trip to Bloomington and back. Mr. Popejoy agreed to care for, feed, and shod the horse, plus pay Mr. Wilson $1. Mr. Popejoy made the trip to Bloomington and returned the horse to Mr. Wilson. Unfortunately, the horse died soon after it was returned home. Mr. Wilson sued Mr. Popejoy and alleged that Mr. Popejoy had not taken proper care of his horse and requested $300 in damages. Mr. Popejoy retained 31-year-old Abraham Lincoln as his attorney. Isaac Wilson retained Stephen A. Douglas as his attorney. Only 27 years of age, Douglas is already famous throughout the state of Illinois. He was a fervent Democrat and one of the great orators of his day. Already he'd been Attorney General of the state and a member of the Illinois House of Representatives. Later that year, he would be appointed Secretary of State, and in 1841 he would be appointed a Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court, the youngest man ever to serve on that tribunal. Douglas was clearly a young man rising swiftly in the world. Here's an illustration of a young Stephen A. Douglas. The first trial heard in Livingston County was Wilson versus Popejoy in May of 1840. And it was the first legal case ever decided in the county. Mr. Lincoln lost that case, but because the jury found in favor of Mr. Wilson. However, Mr. Lincoln was able to get the $300 in damages sought by Mr. Wilson reduced down to just $70. And to give you an idea, $300 in 1840 was worth almost $8,000 in today's dollars. So if we look at the calendar back from 1840, that first case was May 5th of 1840. Just a few months later, the roles were reversed, and the other gentleman sued the other party. So that was just in October. So that's only 5 months later between court cases. So just 5 months later, Isaac Wilson alleged that William Popejoy had stolen meat from Mrs. William McDowell at the village of Avoca. Now, Mrs. McDowell and her husband, when they first came to Illinois, the husband was relatively old, and he died 2 years after arriving in Avoca area. Then, at some point, Mrs. McDowell went blind, and she must have been quite a woman because she continued to hold church services in her house even though she was blind. So I've been unable to determine at the time of the alleged meat theft if she was totally blind yet or just starting to go blind. But anyway, Mr. Popejoy responded by saying he had not stolen the meat, and he sued Mr. Wilson for slander. So Mr. Popejoy must have been happy with Abraham Lincoln's performance in his first case, getting that judgment reduced, because he continued to use Abe Lincoln as his attorney for this legal matter. Mr. Wilson, for whatever reason, switched from Stephen A. Douglas to a lawyer named Burton C. Cook as his attorney. The court hearing for the slander suit of Popejoy versus Wilson was conducted in Pontiac in October of 1840. Mr. Lincoln won this case, and the jury awarded $2,000 to Mr. Popejoy. And the reportings from that era say that this amount was considered a significant judgment. So I converted this amount of money into today's dollars, and I was surprised to see that the judgment was $52,000. So that was quite a large amount of money for a slander suit. After the court cases, William Popejoy moved from Avoca to Cropsey. And as soon as I ran across this fact, it got me starting to think, I wonder if this William Popejoy is related to the current Popejoys from Cropsey. and we'll address that in a moment. William Popejoy died in 1848 at the age of 55. Isaac Wilson moved from Avoca to Pleasant Ridge Township in 1853, and he died in 1888 at the age of 75. I could find no known descendants of Mr. Wilson still in Livingston County. So as I mentioned a minute ago, I got to wondering if Ray Popejoy, who's the founder of Popejoy Plumbing, Heating, Electrical, and Geothermal Company in Fairbury, is he a descendant of the William Popejoy involved in the Lincoln cases? So I use Ancestry.com as my resource to try to answer this question. So using Ancestry.com, it turned out to be easier to work up the family tree, starting with Ray Popejoy, and then going back in time and see if I ran into William C. Popejoy Sr., and sure enough I did. So William C. Popejoy Sr. from 1793 to 1848, he was the farmer involved with the legal cases with Abraham Lincoln. He liked to name his children after presidents, so one of those was Martin Van Buren Popejoy, 1840 to 1904. He had a son named Henry Carl Popejoy. Then his son was Charles H. Popejoy from 1890 to 1956. And then we get to Ray's father, George H. Popejoy, 1925 to 2010. And then Raymond or Ray Popejoy. So William C. Popejoy is Ray Popejoy's third great-grandfather. This is an illustration of a young Abraham Lincoln as the attorney representing Mr. Popejoy in the first case in Livingston County. This illustration was drawn by a gentleman by the name of Lloyd Ostendorf. He drew this in 1976. He loved Abraham Lincoln. He wrote 5 books about Lincoln, and he started drawing Lincoln-related items when he was only 12 years old. So this is a neat illustration. Now that all of you are experts on these first cases, the first thing you're going to point out is there's one mistake here historically. These cases were held inside Henry Weed's log cabin, and I doubt that the log cabin had the nice finished walls and window as shown in this illustration. But still, it's a pretty neat illustration. So in summary, this was a very fun research project. It was very interesting to discover that a current descendant of Mr. Popejoy still lives in this area. It also is interesting to tie this bit of history into the Strevell House in Pontiac, where Mr. Lincoln spent an evening discussing politics with Mr. Strevell, waiting for his train to take him back to Bloomington. So it all adds to the local area history involving Abraham Lincoln. So, thanks for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting and also got to learn some more about our area history involving Abraham Lincoln. Thank you.